You know the word assassin, right? Shadowy figure, a killer in the night. Well, believe it or not, that word, assassin, it comes from a real group from the Middle Ages, the Hashashin. And let me tell you, their true story is way more wild than any of the legends. But to really get it, we've got to peel back the layers of pop culture and see what's actually underneath.
Yeah, you've probably seen them in video games or movies, right? Portrayed as these real-life ninjas, this cult of killers. But is that all they were? Just a bunch of mindless fanatics? Or was there something way, way deeper going on? That's exactly what we're about to dig into.
So, this is the whole game right here, the huge gap between the myth and the reality. The popular story, it paints this picture of drugged up killers, total fanatics who would kill for cash. But the history, the real story, it shows us a super sophisticated political movement, a group of ideological warriors who mastered a brilliant and terrifying military strategy.
Okay, so to really understand these guys, we have to push all that fiction aside. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning, to the world that actually created them. So picture this. It's the 11th century Middle East, and things are chaotic, to say the least. The Islamic world is totally divided. You've got this fierce split between Sunni and Shia Muslims, and a minority group, the Ismailis, are facing some pretty brutal persecution from the ruling Sunni Seljuk Empire. And right in the middle of all this, a brilliant and, frankly, revolutionary missionary named Hassan-i Sabbah decides, you know what? We need to do something different.
Hassan knew that his people couldn't just keep running forever. They needed a base, somewhere safe, somewhere untouchable. And in 1090, he and his followers took over this incredible mountain fortress called Alamut. They called it the Eagle's Nest, and for good reason. It was perched like 10,000 feet up in the mountains. This place became the very heart of their brand new, defiant state.
So you're probably wondering, how on earth does a small group challenge a massive empire? Well, you don't fight them on their terms. Hassan-i Sabbah basically pioneered what we now call asymmetric warfare. Instead of fighting armies head-on, a battle they'd absolutely lose, he would use a small elite force to take out key enemy leaders. This spread chaos and fear that was totally out of proportion to their actual numbers. It was, honestly, a revolution in psychological warfare.
And their method? Oh, it was a patient and absolutely deadly four-step process. Their elite operatives were called the Fidai, which means those who sacrifice themselves. These guys were masters of blending in. We're talking months, sometimes even years, to get close to a target. And the strike itself? It was designed for maximum shock value. A dagger, not in the dark, but in a super public place, like a crowded mosque. The Fidai knew this was a one-way trip, but for them, it was an honorable martyrdom for their cause. Nothing, and I mean nothing, shows their power better than what happened with the great Sultan Saladin. Saladin was a major enemy, and he was dead set on wiping the Hashashin out. So he brings his massive army and lays siege to one of their castles, feeling pretty confident. But then, one morning, Saladin wakes up. Inside his tent. His heavily guarded tent, mind you. And he sees a terrifying sight. Lying on his bed are some still warm scones, a poisoned dagger, and a note. Someone had slipped past every single one of his guards in the dead of night. The message was crystal clear and absolutely chilling. We can get to you. Anytime, anywhere. And next time, this dagger won't just be sitting on your bed. The effect was instant. The mighty Saladin, a guy who feared no army, was so freaked out that he called off the siege and actually negotiated a truce. It was a total victory, one not with an army, but with fear itself. So, we've seen how they really operated. Now it's time to tackle those powerful myths, the crazy stories that have defined them for hundreds of years. Let's start with the name itself. Hashashin wasn't what they called themselves. Nope, it was an insult, a slur that their enemies threw at them. And most historians think it was meant figuratively, like calling someone rabble or a lowlife. It wasn't a literal claim that they were all using hashish. And that brings us to the biggest, most famous myth of all, the one made famous by Marco Polo, the secret paradise garden. The story is wild. It says recruits were drugged up, taken to a hidden paradise garden and told, hey, if you do exactly what we say, you get to come back here forever. It's an amazing story, but there is zero evidence it ever happened. In fact, Hassan-i Sabbah was a super devout Muslim who completely forbade any kind of intoxicant. The reality, their incredible loyalty came from intense discipline and a deep, powerful religious faith, not drugs. So where did the name actually come from? Well, modern scholars have much more plausible ideas. It could come from assassin, which means people faithful to the foundation, the foundation of their faith. Or it might even come from an Egyptian slang word, Hashin, which just means troublemakers. Both of those make a lot more sense than the whole drug story.
Then you have the leap of faith story. This one's super dramatic. The story goes that a visiting leader is shown the Hashashin leader's power when he just casually orders his followers to jump off a tower to their deaths, and they do it without hesitating. Again, it's a fantastic tale, probably cooked up by their enemies to make their devotion seem inhuman, unnatural, like some kind of terrifying mind control. Their discipline was absolutely real, but this story, almost certainly propaganda.
And finally, let's bust the myth that they were just killers for hire. This is really just a modern misunderstanding of what the word assassin has become. The Hashashin weren't motivated by money. They were driven by ideology. They were a political and religious movement literally fighting for their survival, and their targets were always carefully chosen enemies who posed a direct threat to their people. For nearly 200 years, they survived against all odds, this small community holding out against empires. But their time was running out. An unstoppable force was coming. The year was 1256. A new power stormed in from the east, an enemy that even the Hashashin couldn't intimidate, the Mongols.
Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, just swept through Persia. He laid siege to their castles one by one. Even the mighty fortress of Alamet, the eagle's nest, eventually fell. But here's the real tragedy. The Mongols didn't just destroy their castles. They burned the great library at Alamet to the ground, wiping out the Hashashin's own history, their own records, their side of the story. And the consequence of that is huge. With their own records gone, almost everything we think we know about them today was written by the very people who wanted them destroyed.
And that's why their legacy is just so tangled. You could say that for them, history and myth can be as intertwined as the vines on the castle walls of Alamut.
So as you can see, the real Hashashin were so much more complex than the video game villains. They were a persecuted people who used some truly terrifying tactics to survive. And it leaves us with this really challenging question that honestly still resonates today. Were they freedom fighters, just defending their community? Or were they simply fanatical killers? The answer, just like their real history, isn't simple at all.